Hey everyone, today I want to share a story that's stuck with me for years. A night that started off as just some harmless fun but ended up being way more than we bargained for. So, many of you might have heard of a spirit board used to communicate with the unknown, right? Well, in Japan, there's a similar game called kakuri. It's a bit different because instead of a board, you draw the setup on a piece of paper and use a coin instead of a planchette. I played it once, and the events that followed were, well, pretty strange. In Japan, summer is the season for sharing ghost stories. It's like how October and Halloween feel in other parts of the world. Spooky and filled with tales of the supernatural. Back in the summer of 2005, one of my best childhood friends invited me and some others to hang out. His girlfriend wanted to introduce some of her single friends to us, and naturally we were interested. We thought it would be fun to visit a supposedly haunted spot, thinking we could impress the girls by acting brave. We chose a spot that was eerie but not too frightening, just to keep things fun. The girls were definitely spooked, which worked in our favor, and we enjoyed the evening. Afterward, we decided to hit up a cafe to grab some snacks and relax. As we sat around at the cafe, we talked about the evening and shared some urban legends. It was your typical summer night in Japan. Then, one of the girls, C, asked if any of us had ever played kakuri. We all laughed, as many of us had played it back in middle or high school, though some of us hadn't. C explained the game to those who were unfamiliar, and my friend, N, suggested that we should give it a try that night. Since I was getting along well with one of the girls, I was all for keeping the night going. We headed back to N's apartment to play the game. On the way, we stopped at a convenience store to pick up some snacks and drinks. Once we got to N's place, C prepared the kakuri setup on a piece of paper and reminded us how to play. We opened a window, as it's believed this allows a spirit to enter, and began the game. No one took it too seriously. There was a lot of joking around. The coin moved in response to our questions, but I was convinced that C was just pushing it. Even though I didn't believe anything would happen, we followed the tradition of tearing up the paper afterward, and C promised to spend the coin the next day to avoid any bad luck. We were still in the mood for something spooky, so someone suggested we play a traditional storytelling game called Haiku Monogatari Keidenkai, which translates to a gathering of 100 strange stories. The game involves telling scary stories while gradually extinguishing candles. The idea is that when the final candle is blown out after the last story, something might appear in the darkness. We didn't have 100 candles, but we bought enough to set the mood, lighting them and turning off the lights. As we sat in a circle, the flickering candlelight made the atmosphere just right for sharing spooky stories. Despite some nervous laughter, we all took turns telling tales. Most of the stories were the usual ones you'd expect, but when it was my turn, I decided to share something personal. I told them about a strange phone call I received years ago at a park. The room grew silent as I finished my story and blew out the last candle, leaving us in complete darkness. For a moment, the only sound was our breathing. Then one of the girls screamed, probably startled by someone's prank. The tension broke, and we all started laughing as N turned the lights back on. The girl I had been talking to earlier gave me her number, and we agreed to meet up later in the week. It was well past 1 a.m., so we all headed home. That night, I had a vivid and unsettling dream. In the dream, I was in an unfamiliar high-rise apartment. I saw a man pacing back and forth in the living room, clearly upset. I tried to speak to him, but he didn't respond. Suddenly, he ran out to the balcony and jumped. I woke up in a cold sweat, really shaken by how real it felt. A few days later, I met up with N again. He seemed off, and as we were driving around, he finally opened up about something that had been bothering him. As we were passing through my neighborhood, we witnessed something shocking. A man had fallen from a nearby high-rise and landed on the guardrail. The sight was horrifying, and what made it even worse was that it was the same man I had seen in my dream. N was just as shaken, and as we talked, we realized we had both dreamed about the same man. Neither of us could explain it, and it left us both deeply disturbed. We shared what happened with our friends, but no one had any answers. It was the last time any of us played any games or visited haunted places. The whole experience was too unsettling. To this day, N and I remain friends, but we never talk about what happened. I move to the US and visit Japan occasionally, but I avoid that area entirely. I've never had another dream like that, but I still wonder what it all meant. Writing this down has given me a sense of closure, but it also serves as a reminder to be careful with things we don't fully understand. And if you've ever had a similar experience, let me know. Stay safe, everyone, and think twice before you mess with the unknown. It was probably summer of 2010, and I was about 15 or 16 years old. One night, my neighbors and I decided to sneak out, even though it was a school night. We were doing typical rebellious teen stuff, walking around the neighborhood, chatting, and just trying to enjoy the freedom. As we wandered, we started telling each other creepy stories, but not the usual ghost tales. We talked about some unsettling things that had happened in our area, like an old crime from the 70s and stories about kidnappers. Basically, anything that would spook each other. It was around 1 a.m., and we were on our way home, walking down a long, dark street. The road was poorly lit with only a few streetlights, and there were lots of oak trees around, making it even darker. To top it off, it had started raining, adding to the eerie atmosphere. A little ahead of us, on the left side of the street, we noticed someone coming out of a house. It was a hooded figure, and they started walking in the same direction we were. Then, they crossed the street, heading toward us, so we decided to switch sides to avoid them. But then they crossed back, heading straight for us, and we ended up facing them under one of the few dim streetlights. To our surprise, when they removed their hood, it wasn't some scary figure. It was a woman with bright red hair, probably in her late 30s or early 40s. She didn't smell like she'd been drinking, but she seemed out of it, like she wasn't fully there. She had this strange way of looking at us, almost like she could see right through us. She started asking us odd questions, like why we were out so late where we lived, and if our parents knew we were out. At one point, she tried to get close to me, even reaching out to pull me in. I was already on edge, so I quickly stepped back and told her not to touch me. While all this was happening, we noticed a man walking down the street from the same direction we had come. He was wearing a light blue baseball cap and smoking a cigarette. He looked like he was in his late 20s, and he had this serious, focused walk that made him seem pretty intimidating. He walked right past us, so close that it felt intentional. After we managed to get away from the woman, telling her to leave us alone, the man suddenly turned around and came back toward us. He asked, "What did that woman say to you? What did she ask?" We told him about the questions she had asked and that she had really freaked us out. The guy just nodded, thanked us, and then quickly went after the woman, who had started walking back toward where she had come from. We watched as he caught up to her, pulled her back into the house she had exited from, even though she was trying to resist. I never saw either of them again, even though this all happened just one street over from my house. The whole experience left me with so many questions. Who were they? Why did she approach us? And why was that guy so interested in what she said to us? That night, I couldn't sleep at all. It was just too unsettling. During the whole situation, I was convinced that the woman was trying to distract us so the guy could do something sinister, like we had been talking about earlier with those kidnapping stories. Even though it might not sound like the scariest thing that ever happened, it was definitely strange, and it left me feeling really uneasy.
Hashtag this story isn't mine, but it's one my father told me. It took place in the late 90s during two separate occasions. My dad only got interested in hunting after he finished high school, and he started going on trips to northern Canada with a friend. This was their third time in that area, so they found a spot they liked and set up camp as night started to fall. As they were getting tired and ready to settle in, something strange happened. Plop! They looked over and saw a huge splash in the middle of the lake. They were confused and tried to figure out what could have caused it. Then suddenly, plop! This time it happened right in front of my dad. He realized what it was. Something had thrown a 50-pound rock clear across the 200-yard lake. Dazed and terrified, he ran into the tent, grabbed his binoculars, and looked around. What he saw next was unbelievable. Standing on the other side of the lake was a figure about 6 feet 9 inches tall. He couldn't make out if it was covered in hair, but it was clearly massive, something that couldn't easily fit through a doorway. It was also incredibly strong to have thrown that rock. Just then, the creature let out a loud, deep roar that echoed across the lake. Panicking, my dad did what anyone might do. He grabbed his gun and fired a few shots at it. But the creature didn't immediately run away. It seemed to stand its ground as if to say, "I'm in charge here," before slowly retreating into the woods. They didn't see any other animals for the rest of the trip and were too scared to leave the camp. My dad never figured out what that creature was, so he chalked it up to something like Bigfoot. But I'm curious, what do you think it could have been? On another trip, though not in the same place, my dad was with a guide in western Alaska. It had been raining for 4 days, and he was sleeping in his tent when he heard rustling and snarling behind him. He quickly grabbed his gun and aimed it at the tent door. Then he saw something pressing against the side of the tent, knuckles slowly moving along the wall and brushing against his arm before moving away. Once again, my dad attributed this encounter to Bigfoot, but I'm still open to hearing other opinions on what it could have been. This happened in northwest Quebec, so if anyone knows any local folklore, that might help explain these experiences.
I'm from India, and my family's roots are in a village in Rajasthan. Rajasthan is known for its vast deserts, and our village is mostly open land with little vegetation. Although I was born in the city, my family made sure we frequently visited the village so I wouldn't lose touch with our roots. During these visits, I made many friends in the village, and we often played together on the wide open land in the evenings, just before dark. The days were too hot to be outside, and the nights held their own dangers, not just from wild animals or unsavory people, but from something much stranger. One evening, after playing with my cousin and friends, we all went to bed as darkness settled in. But later that night, I was awakened by an unusual clicking sound. It was strange and persistent, so I nudged my cousin, who was sleeping next to me, and asked if he knew what it was. He didn't, but he advised against going outside to investigate, something village folks knew better than to do at night. Despite his warning, we moved towards the main gate of the house and sat there, listening intently to the sound. It wasn't just any noise. It was the sound of someone making a clicking noise with their tongue. The sound seemed to be moving away from us, and we strained to hear it better. Then, suddenly, a terrifying scream cut through the silence, followed by a voice that sounded exactly like mine, calling my cousin's name, Jagdish, just like I would while we were playing. We both panicked and ran to where the adults were sleeping, huddled together under the open sky. The adults were already awake, having heard the scream. My uncles gathered us all together and led us in prayer. They explained that the sound we heard was likely from a creature known as a chalava. People in the village had encountered it before, though no one had ever seen its true form. The chalava could mimic voices, much like a skinwalker, or even copy someone's appearance, though there was always something unsettling about it, as if it were wearing a human suit that didn't quite fit. So we sat together, praying while outside, a creature that sounded exactly like me continued to call my cousin's name. Back in 2002, I lived on a mountain in southern New Hampshire for a few years. The mountain had a history of being mined for iron ore, and there were areas near the top where a radio tower stood that had tunnels in the ground. These tunnels were dangerous. If someone were to fall in, they might never be found. My family and I lived in a small house in a clearing, surrounded by dense woods, with a narrow dirt road that barely allowed 2 cars to pass. During the summer, we often woke up to see spotlights shining from above, followed by the sounds of helicopters. We knew they were searching for illegal activity, likely looking for hidden marijuana plants. Although I never came across any growers myself, being on the state line between New Hampshire and Massachusetts, it wasn't out of the question. After a few years, the helicopters and spotlights became routine, until one night when something different happened. Our windows were open, letting in the cool evening breeze, and the comforting sound of crickets filled the air. I woke up to a bright spotlight shining over our house. Nothing unusual, but this time something felt off. I noticed the crickets had stopped chirping, which was strange and unsettling. Feeling uneasy, I got up to check on our two boys in the nursery and then headed to the bathroom. After seeing that they were sound asleep, I began to close their door when another bright light illuminated the house. This time, I noticed something odd. I didn't hear the usual sound of helicopters. I stood there, listening intently, but heard nothing. The light went out, and I shrugged it off, heading to the bathroom. I had a habit of not turning on the lights at night, even though it was very dark without any streetlights. I knew my way around the house well enough to navigate without them. While I was in the bathroom, the spotlight appeared again, lighting up the room. When I finished, I considered stepping out onto the back deck to see what was going on. But as I approached the door, a strong feeling of unease stopped me. Something told me it wasn't a good idea, so I followed my instincts and returned to the bedroom. The light outside seemed to dim as I walked away, which struck me as unusual. Spotlights never seemed to behave like this, and they certainly never stayed over our house for so long. I paused at the bedroom door, listening carefully. Deciding to wake my husband, I walked into the room and was startled to see a tall figure standing next to my side of the bed. I'm about 5'6", and my husband is 6'2". He usually slept without any clothes, so when I saw the tall figure, I assumed it was him, up and checking on me. I walked by the figure, even placing my hand on its chest, and apologized for being in the bathroom. The dim light went out, and the figure left the room. Just then, I heard my husband snoring. A chill ran down my spine. Who had been standing by my bed? I didn't wake my husband, but I immediately ran to the boys' room, heart pounding. I opened the door and turned on a small light, just enough to see the room without waking them. Both boys were in bed, sound asleep. I quickly closed the windows and the door, then headed to the kitchen to grab a knife. Someone was in the house. I turned on all the lights and checked every room. Everything was clear. I even checked the attic and basement. Still nothing. I made sure all the doors were locked. They were. What was going on? My husband finally woke up and came out, rubbing his eyes. He asked what I was doing, and I told him someone was in the house. Just as I said that, the spotlight reappeared and then went out again. With my husband now fully awake, I ran to the sliding doors that led to the deck. I stepped outside, but the spotlight turned off again. My husband joined me, and we watched something in the sky silently hovering over the trees. It moved slowly, turning the spotlight on and off repeatedly until it disappeared from view. To this day, I have no idea what that was, or who I saw standing next to my bed. My husband grabbed his gun and thoroughly checked the house, but we never found anyone. Hey everyone, this is Spooky Ape Agency. I go by the alias Thomas, not my real name, of course. I'd like to share a chilling, surreal experience from my life. I hope you find the story intriguing. Sometimes, the eerie atmosphere of a workplace can be unsettling. Occasionally, something beyond our understanding emerges, bringing with it strange and terrifying occurrences. Let me tell you about a real experience I had while working in a factory. It was that sound again. Even though I had heard it before, it still startled me. I glanced at the door, though I knew it was closed. The sound of a broom sweeping the floor, brushing away dust and dirt, filled the air. It might seem ordinary during the day, but in the middle of the night, it takes on a whole new meaning. The sound grew louder, moving closer to the warehouse door where I was trying to sleep. Slowly, I sat up, pressing my back against the wall. The warehouse was pitch dark because I had intentionally left the lights off, relying only on the faint, eerie glow seeping through the glass window from outside. As before, the sweeping sound was the first thing I noticed. But as the source of the sound approached, I began to hear something else. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, like someone wearing rubber sandals shuffling across the cement floor, creating a distinctive keep-plek, keep-plek, keep-plek sound. The steps matched the rhythm of the sweeping. The closer it got, the more tense and frightened I became. The cool night air seemed to grow even colder, sending chills down my spine. I couldn't shake the memory of what Sean, a coworker who had been with the company for much longer than me, had told me. He had shared stories of strange sightings in the factory, including one of a woman who used to work as a cleaner there. She had passed away about 10 years ago, but Sean claimed that those who worked the night shifts still occasionally heard her sweeping, mopping, and cleaning. And now it seemed like I was hearing her myself, the woman who had been gone for so long. I focused intently, trying to catch every sound. The sweeping and footsteps grew clearer, more unsettling with each passing moment. Then, something even more terrifying happened. I heard a voice. It was a woman's voice, murmuring softly, mixed with what sounded like suppressed laughter. The sound was eerie and sent waves of fear through me. I pressed myself further into the corner of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. I kept my eyes on the door and the window, certain that whatever was out there would soon pass by. The sounds grew louder and closer, and I could see something moving in the faint light beneath the door. Slow steps and the occasional sweep of the broom. The figure was right outside the door. The murmuring grew clearer, and the eerie giggles continued, making my fear rise to new heights. I was frozen, too terrified to move. The figure suddenly stopped moving and stood still. The silence that followed was suffocating. My mind raced with thoughts of what might happen next. Then, knock, knock, knock. The sound of someone knocking on the door echoed through the room. Cold sweat ran down my face as I curled up further in the corner. Knock, knock, knock. The knock came again. There was no way I was going to open that door. My mind was racing with prayers, hoping for some kind of protection. After the second knock, there was a long silence, which seemed to stretch on forever. Then the figure began moving again, this time towards the glass window next to the door. I had recently left a residential facility where I worked as a licensed nursing assistant, LNA. The day after one of the residents I cared for passed away, I made the decision to move on. The facility was just a few houses down from where I lived. So many of the residents and their spouses would often see me waiting for the school bus with my kids and wave. One morning, as I was waiting for the bus, I noticed someone walking towards me from the direction of the facility. After my kids got on the bus, I heard my name being called. It was the wife of the resident who had recently passed. She was holding something in her hands. I was on my way to work, but I felt like I should stay and talk with her. As we met halfway, she hugged me tightly and thanked me for all the care I had given her husband and for the conversations we'd had over the years. I could sense that something was off. She then told me that her husband wasn't always the person I knew him to be. I nodded, assuming she was referring to the challenges he faced in his later years, which often made him difficult to deal with. She explained that her husband had taken up painting after he retired and that she had managed to get rid of all his artwork except for one piece. I thought it was strange that she didn't want to keep any of them, but perhaps their home was too small to store everything. She insisted that I take the last painting and do whatever needed to be done with it. I tried to politely refuse, telling her it wasn't necessary, but she insisted, reminding me that I no longer worked at the facility, so I could accept it. She was very persistent and seemed convinced that I would know what to do with it. Puzzled by her request, I eventually agreed to take the painting. After giving her another hug, I mentioned that I had to get to work, and she seemed relieved as she walked away. I rushed back home, leaving the painting, still wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with twine, leaning against the living room closet. I planned to look at it when I got back. Later that evening, after getting home, making dinner, and putting the kids to bed, I remembered the painting. I decided it was time to open it. The artwork was unusual, just a brown canvas with a small red figure in the lower right corner. Still unsure why she would give me such a strange painting, I decided to hang it up. During the night, I was startled by a loud crash. When I went to the living room, I found the painting had fallen off the wall and was lying in the middle of the room, far from where I had hung it. I assumed the nail must have fallen out, but after checking, Both the nail and the frame were fine. I rehung the painting. The next morning, I discovered the painting on the floor again. Frustrated, I decided to lean it against the closet instead. As I was cleaning up the wrapping paper from the night before, a note fell out. It was from the wife. She explained that another LNA, a friend of mine, had told her that I would know how to dispose of the painting. She mentioned that her husband had been abusive before they moved to the facility and that he had been involved in some unsettling practices. She hinted that I might know someone who could help with haunted items. It turned out the entire gift was really a way for her to pass on something she couldn't keep. In the end, I did reach out to someone who dealt with haunted objects, and they were more than happy to take the painting off my hands. The lesson here? Always ask more questions before accepting gifts. They might be more than you bargained for.
Back in August 2005, I was on a trucking trip across the United States with my ex. We had traveled coast to coast and experienced our fair share of strange occurrences, but this one was definitely more on the paranormal side. We finally made it to New Orleans, a city famous for its voodoo culture and Mardi Gras celebrations. My brother had told me stories about the cemeteries, voodoo shops, and other peculiar things in the city, and I'd always been curious to see them for myself. Call it morbid curiosity or just a fascination with the mysterious, I was eager to explore. I'd recently gotten a new 35mm camera, and even though it was considered old school by 2005 standards, I liked the idea of capturing images without the instant feedback of digital. It made me feel like a real artist. After we dropped the trailer at a Home Depot where we were unloading, we decided to visit Lafayette Cemetery. We wound our way through the streets, marveling at the old plantation-style homes. One massive house stood out. It was beautiful but gave off an uneasy feeling. Something about it made us decide not to stop and keep driving instead. My ex wasn't a fan of anything unknown, spiritual, or even slightly related to the occult. He flat out refused to go with me, claiming it was boring, but I could tell he was actually scared. When we arrived at the cemetery, I was surprised to find the street nearly empty. I had expected more tourists. Since we were in a residential area, we couldn't park the truck. So my ex handed me a prepaid cell phone with about 15 minutes of call time left and told me to call when I was done. Then he dropped me off at the gate and sped away. The mausoleums were like finely built houses, some covered in moss, others with fresh flowers. As I walked the stone paths, I felt an ominous presence, like I was being watched. A chill ran through me, even though it was nearly 90 degrees outside. I continued taking pictures, capturing the weeping cherub statues and praying figures on the headstones. I lost track of time, and the sun began to dip behind a particularly eerie tree. Remembering that we were in the south and that something like a snake could be lurking, I decided to head back to the gate. The gate seemed even more foreboding in the fading light. I quickened my pace and noticed an older woman of African descent, probably around 80, standing nearby. She wore a brightly colored outfit, with gray hair peeking out from a bandana. Necklaces that appeared to be made of wood or bone hung around her neck. She must have been startled because she turned her head towards me so quickly that I was surprised she didn't hurt herself. Her gaze was intense. One eye was milky, while the other darted around as if searching for something. I tried to rationalize her sudden appearance, thinking she might have been placing flowers on a nearby grave. But when I got closer, there were no flowers. She motioned for me to come over, and despite my gut telling me otherwise, I cautiously approached. I figured she might need help standing up or getting to her car. I was trying to be a good Samaritan, thinking I was still at a safe enough distance to make a quick exit if needed. But before I knew it, I was within her reach. She grabbed my arm with surprising strength, leaving bruises on my forearm. Her nails dug into my skin, and I let out a small yelp. She pulled me close, her face leathery and her breath foul. She smelled of decay and something else I couldn't place. In a deep, raspy voice, she told me to get out. Startled, I managed to stammer, "Excuse me? I thought this was a public cemetery. I'm just visiting. I mean no harm." She pulled me closer, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and something darker. She hissed, "Leave this place, or you will drown for your sins." Just then, I heard a voice in the distance. It was my ex on the phone, asking if I needed to be picked up. I must have dialed the phone without realizing it. As quickly as she had grabbed me, the woman let go, almost throwing me to the ground. For someone who looked so frail, she was incredibly strong. I walked out of the gate and waited on the curb for my ex to arrive. It was getting darker, and the sound of crickets started up in the distance. I could still see the woman pacing back and forth near a grave, her mouth moving as if she were talking to herself, or maybe cursing me. Finally, the truck's lights came into view, and I felt a wave of relief. My ex pulled up, and I quickly hopped into the front seat, slamming the door behind me. Seeing my scared expression, he immediately began teasing me, saying I was afraid of the dark and that he had warned me not to visit a place of the dead. I told him what had happened with the old woman, and he looked at me blankly before asking, "What woman?" and pointing toward the gate. The woman had vanished. There were no other cars on the street, and the area was empty except for our idling truck. There was only one way in and out of the cemetery, and we were parked right in front of the gate. If anyone had come through, we would have seen them. I insisted we leave the state, telling him the woman had warned me. He didn't believe me, but agreed to take a job that would get us out of the South. We put in for a few different routes, one of which was a short run to Georgia, while the other would take us to Northern California, though it required us to drive empty to Biloxi, Mississippi. That night, we got confirmation for the California trip, and we hit the road. 2 weeks later, Hurricane Katrina struck. Had I not listened to that old woman in the cemetery, we might have been among the casualties.
When I was around 15 or 16, I had a dream that still unsettles me to this day. My parents were divorced, and my sister and I would split our time between their homes. My mom's house was always comfortable, but my dad's basement apartment had a strange, heavy atmosphere that made me uneasy. The woman he rented from, who lived upstairs, was also quite peculiar. I often heard organ music or a low, droning sound coming from above late at night, and there was a constant flow of visitors to her house. I'd had some odd dreams at my dad's place before, but nothing like what I'm about to describe. The dream started with what seemed like me waking up from a nightmare, drenched in a cold sweat. The apartment was eerily silent, which was strange because it was just after midnight, and my dad was usually up playing guitar or using the computer at that time. That was the first sign that something was off. The second was when I noticed that the light coming through my window was a bright, unnatural red. I then became aware of a panting noise and looked toward my slightly open bedroom door. The same red light was coming from behind it. I froze in fear as I watched the door slowly open, pushed by the snout of a large black dog. The dog, which had shining white eyes and looked part wolf, walked into my room and stood by my bed. It stared at me with its mouth slightly open, saliva dripping from its tongue. Then, in a deep, emotionless voice, the dog communicated with me, but its mouth didn't move. It simply looked into my eyes, and I heard the words in my mind, "I am the one you should follow." Even though I was terrified, I felt an overwhelming urge to get out of bed and follow the dog. So I did. As we walked from my room into the kitchen and dining area, the air became noticeably colder, and my stomach twisted with fear. There, I saw my mom and dad, who weren't speaking at the time, along with my sister, stepfather, and stepmother, people who had never met, all seated at the dinner table in silence with empty plates in front of them. The same red light that had been streaming through my bedroom window now bathed them all. The black dog turned to face me again and said, "This is where you belong." Everyone at the table looked at me with blank, expressionless faces, and in that moment, I woke up for real. The clock read 3 a.m. I was too shaken to go back to sleep and didn't share that nightmare with anyone for almost a month. That dream still haunts me, and I often wonder what it meant and why it felt so real. This is another experience from my time working the night shift as a security guard at the local port. If you're familiar with the setting from my previous story, Traumatizing Night Shift, then you'll know what I'm talking about. For those who aren't, here's another incident that truly frightened me. This story isn't something I experienced firsthand, but it happened to one of my coworkers during my shift. It left such a mark on me that I became anxious even about using the restroom alone. To give you some context, the local port covers nearly 2 miles, and there are 3 security guards on duty during the night, including myself. Our main post is at the front gate, a small building about the size of a trailer. This post is separated from the rest of the site, including the offices, slabs, oil rigs, and other buildings. The offices and restrooms are within walking distance, but the area is poorly lit, making it feel especially eerie. Around 2 a.m., our lieutenant left the post to use the restroom. The restrooms are located in the middle of the office buildings, which have a creepy vibe, probably because they were built in the 1950s. The old wooden floorboards and walls add to the unsettling atmosphere. About 7 minutes later, my coworker Mike and I looked out the post window and saw our lieutenant sprinting back toward us. At first, we found it amusing because he's not exactly the athletic type, so watching him run was a bit funny. But then it hit us. This was the same guy who had warned us about strange things happening at this site. He'd mentioned seeing things before, and while it didn't usually bother him, we couldn't help but wonder what he'd encountered this time to make him so panicked. When the lieutenant burst into the post, Mike and I just stared at him as he tried to catch his breath. After a moment, he finally spoke, saying, "This is the last time I'm using the restrooms in that office building." I was in the 3rd stall when I heard the restroom door creak open. I assumed it was one of you, so I didn't think much of it, but then I realized I didn't hear any footsteps. I paused the music I was listening to and waited. A few seconds passed, and then I heard the water faucet turn on by itself. Right after that, the air dryer started. I finished up as fast as I could and ran back because I knew it wasn't either of you in there. The creepy part is that both the faucet and the hand dryer are motion activated, so something had to trigger them. Before this incident, I was already uneasy about using that restroom alone, especially at night. I always dreaded the thought of something like this happening to me. The worst part is that when you're using the restroom, you're in a vulnerable position. Plus, those restrooms are deep inside the building, and it's pitch black in there. You need a flashlight to navigate, and the silence is unnerving. I've had a few more strange experiences while working here, and I'll be posting them soon. This happened about 3 years ago when I was 18. I spent that summer at my aunt's cottage with some friends and my girlfriend. My aunt owns property on a small island off the coast of a town near where I live in Canada. I'd rather not say exactly where. Anyway, a few friends and I decided to spend a couple of weeks there to celebrate graduating high school. We hung out at the beach, partied, and had a blast. Some of my best memories come from that time on the island. My aunt had taught me how to sail, and once I was old enough, I got my boating license and was allowed to take her boat out on my own. We spent a lot of time on the water, fishing, swimming, and just cruising for fun. One evening, the sky was clear, the water was calm, and the wind was light, so we decided to sail out to watch the sunset and have a few drinks before heading back to shore. We ended up going farther out than I intended, probably because we were so caught up in talking and having fun that I lost track of how far we had gone. After the sunset, we just sat there on the water for a while, enjoying the evening. About an hour passed when a small wave suddenly rocked our boat. It wasn't a big wave, but it startled us because the water had been so calm. One of my friends looked over the side and said it seemed like the wave kept going, like something was pushing it. We knew he wasn't too fond of the ocean, so we teased him a bit about being scared. But then he grabbed my arm and insisted I take a look. I glanced over the side but didn't see anything. No waves, not even a ripple in the water. We shrugged it off and went back to our conversation. Another hour or two went by when another wave hit the boat. This time I was confused because I had positioned the boat to face the waves, so they shouldn't have hit us from the side. I figured maybe we had drifted, but my friend jumped up again and ran to the edge to look. There it is again. That wave is moving on its own, he shouted, urging us to look. This time when we did, we saw it too, a wave moving across the water. It reminded me of the way water ripples when a fish swims just below the surface, but this wave was much bigger. It was getting late, and I could see that my friend was really unsettled, so I decided it was time to head back to shore. On the way back, my friend kept his eyes glued to the water, looking for that wave. Everyone was a bit tipsy by then, but he wouldn't stop talking about how he saw something in the water. He got so worked up that I eventually stopped the boat, sat him down, and told him he was stressing over nothing. Seeing a wave in the ocean isn't exactly unusual, but he kept insisting, so I went over to the side and looked again. I kept saying, "Still nothing, just more water." But then something caught my eye. I peered down into the water and saw something floating up toward the surface. The water was already dark, but I swear I saw an eye looking back at me. I stared at it for a few seconds before it sank back down into the depths. As soon as it disappeared, the boat rocked again, as if pushed by another wave. My friend started freaking out, so I headed back to shore without saying a word about what I'd seen. When we got back, I told everyone except the friend who was already scared. One of my other friends suggested it might have been a large squid since their eyes are among the biggest in the animal kingdom. I looked up pictures of squid eyes later, and while colossal squid do have large eyes, the one I saw seemed even bigger. Plus, I didn't think squid lived that close to the surface, but I'm no expert. I know this story might not be as scary as some others, but at the time it was terrifying. Whatever that I belonged to, it felt like it could have easily sunk our boat with all of us on it. Flight 1087 to Atlanta is now boarding, the gate agent announced over the intercom. Finally, I thought, relieved that my wait was almost over. Being in first class, I knew I wouldn't have to deal with the usual crowding in economy. Now boarding military personnel and those needing assistance, she called out again. Not wanting to wait any longer, I decided to head to the gate. As I rushed forward, I nearly bumped into a woman in a military uniform. "Sorry about that, first class," I said with a quick smile and wink, moving past her. However, the gate agent stopped me. "Sir, we're not boarding first class yet," she said, slightly annoyed. I wasn't about to let that stop me. After a few words, she scanned my boarding pass and let me through. "That's more like it," I thought as I settled into my first class seat. Once I was seated, I connected my phone to the plane's Wi-Fi and sent a quick message to my wife. "Just boarded. I'll be in Atlanta by 4. Love you. See you soon," she replied. "I've been texting you all morning. I was getting worried. Yeah, I woke up late and had to rush. Sorry about that. Okay, be careful. Call me when you land, and I'll pick you up." "Sure thing. By the way, the plane's Wi-Fi is a bit spotty, so I might not be able to text." In truth, I didn't even read her last message. I loved her, but our relationship had become routine. My frequent travel often led me to seek other distractions. As I waited for my seatmate, I hoped it would be someone interesting. Maybe this time, I'd get lucky and not be stuck next to the usual talkative businessman. Soon, a woman boarded with just a backpack. She scanned the seat numbers and paused in front of my row. Please let her be my seatmate, I thought. "Excuse me, sir, could I get in?" she asked with a pleasant voice. "Absolutely," I said, standing up quickly to let her into the window seat. She was stunning, blonde hair, bright blue eyes, and an elegant presence. I quickly sent one last message to my wife. "Hey, the flight's delayed. I might be an hour or 2 late. I'll grab an Uber so you don't miss picking up the kids. Love you." Perfect, I thought. Now I had a few extra hours. As the plane took off, I started chatting with my seatmate, dropping subtle compliments and flirty remarks. She didn't flirt back, but she wasn't offended either. Maybe just a bit reserved. As the flight went on, I got a little bolder, lightly touching her arm or making a playful comment, though she mostly kept her distance. After a quick trip to the restroom, I returned to find that the woman was no longer there. Instead, the military woman I had nearly bumped into earlier was in her seat. Excuse me, I think you're in the wrong seat. My friend was sitting there," I said, confused and a bit irritated. "You should sit down, John. There's turbulence coming," she said calmly. "How do you know my name?" I asked, shocked. Just then, the The flight attendant's voice came over the intercom. All passengers, please fasten your seatbelts. We're expecting turbulence. I quickly sat down as the plane started to shake. I glanced over at the woman, noticing a strange, almost eerie smile on her face. Her eyes were cold and distant. Don't speak, just listen, she commanded. This is the end for you, John. Your actions, your infidelity, your disregard for others have caught up with you. I tried to protest, but she silenced me with a gesture. Your wife reached out to me. She's tired of your lies. After looking closely at your life, it's clear you're destined for a different path. That woman earlier, she was just a test. I wanted to defend myself, but I couldn't move or speak. It was as if I was paralyzed. This is what's going to happen, John, she continued. In about 2.5 minutes, this plane will be struck by lightning, knocking out all power. The captain will have to make an emergency landing. Don't worry, everyone will survive, except for you. Panic surged through me as I processed her words. My phone buzzed with a new message. I couldn't reach it, but the woman picked it up and held it in front of me. Hey, by now you've met our mutual friend. I wish things were different, but I can't do this anymore. You know the wrongs you've done. The kids and I will be fine. Goodbye, John. As I finished reading, the message vanished, and my phone screen went black. Suddenly, the plane dipped sharply as lightning struck, causing a deafening crack throughout the cabin. The woman stood up and started walking toward the cockpit. Who are you? I screamed internally. She paused, turned, and looked directly at me. Her once cold eyes now glowed with an intense, fiery light. Most people know me as Lucifer, she said with a smirk, but you can call me Lucy. And with that, she disappeared. When my mom, sister, and I first moved to Massachusetts, I was 10 years old. We had only ever lived in small, safe towns with a few thousand people. But this new place was very different. My mom, being young, didn't fully understand the safety concerns that came with a bigger area. I loved riding my bike, and I did so often since I had no specific boundaries on how far I could go from our apartment. My only rule was to be home just after dark. I didn't even have to check in. Every day, I would explore a little farther, learn one more road or block, memorize it, and then return home. One day, I stumbled upon an open bring-your-own free golf course. It was a pretty area, bordered by woods on 3 sides, with the side I approached from facing a road and parking area. I wanted to play but didn't have the equipment, so I settled for watching others, which I found just as enjoyable. I parked my bike and sat in the grass. I quickly noticed that everyone on the grass was much older than me. Looking back, I'd say no one there was younger than 45. I was aware that I was getting some curious looks but didn't think much of it. Being new to many places in my life, I was used to people staring or talking about me. The older couples around me seemed more amused than bothered by my presence. I don't know how long I stayed there, but it had to have been a few hours, as I remember it getting darker as time passed. Suddenly, everyone started to leave, probably heading home for dinner. I stood up and was about to head back to my bike when I noticed a tall man across the course, directly opposite me. I figured he wouldn't stay much longer, so I decided to wait until he left before heading home. After a few minutes, I noticed that he kept glancing in my direction. I didn't think much of it because I had been watching him too. It wouldn't have been fair of me to expect him to ignore me. He missed a couple of shots and lost a ball into the woods. Soon after, he packed up his clubs and started heading out, still glancing at me from time to time. As he was leaving, I lost interest and began unlocking my bike. With the lock and key in my pocket, I suddenly had a strange feeling, like the world had just gotten darker. I looked back and was startled to see the man standing a few feet behind me, his shadow just barely touching mine. I looked up at him, wondering what he wanted. He smiled down at me. "Hello, young miss," he said. "Where's your father?" My dad passed away, I replied, used to having to explain it. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Did he teach you how to play? He asked. No, I don't know how to play. I just think it looks fun, I said, wondering if he was upset that I had been watching him. There was something unsettling about him. His smile was too forced, and his expression too intense. Would you like to learn? I have a little time before I need to head home, he offered. I wasn't completely unaware of stranger danger, but I didn't feel unsafe at that moment. I was near a busy road, and though the sun was setting, it wasn't dark yet. I knew not to go into anyone's car, house, or any private place. Feeling safe enough and excited to learn something new, I agreed. We moved to the middle of the field, and he showed me how to stand, hold the club, and swing. I did quite well and made sure to keep a safe distance from him. Every time I hit a ball, I would go retrieve it, and eventually I started picking up the ones he hit as well. I didn't notice anything unusual at first. I was having fun. But as we continued, I started to notice a few odd things. For such light activity, he was getting very sweaty. Every time I hit a ball, he would glance up and down the street, as if checking for cars. That behavior made me uneasy. What was he looking for? So I started paying more attention. I noticed that he seemed to be hitting the ball to the left, closer to the wooded area. A problem he didn't have when I was watching him earlier. His shots were pulling more and more to the left, and the balls I was retrieving were getting closer to the trees. I decided to test something. I watched him hit a ball and noticed his odd behavior. He would first glance at a specific spot in the thicket, where there seemed to be an opening in the trees. Then he would look at where the hole was, but twist his hand slightly, as if intentionally sending the ball closer to that opening. The ball landed just a couple of feet from the opening, and he checked the street more thoroughly. Satisfied with the empty street, he looked over at me expectantly, waiting for me to fetch the ball. It dawned on me, why would he intentionally hit the ball in the wrong direction unless he wanted me to go there? And why would he want me close to that path unless he wanted me to enter the thicket? I had no doubt that he was trying to lure me over there. I also knew that I couldn't just leave suddenly, as it might anger him and make him more aggressive. If I wanted to get out of there safely, he couldn't suspect that I found him suspicious. An idea struck me. I pretended to check my pocket, as if looking for something. I loudly exclaimed, "Oh no, where is it?" as though I was worried. He looked over, confused and a bit frustrated. "What's wrong?" he asked, trying to sound calm. "I can't find my phone and lock." I lied. I was supposed to message my mom at 6. The last time I forgot. She called 911 and I got in so much trouble. I tucked the lock into my pocket and pulled up the fabric a little without revealing it. I can't find either of them. I started pretending to search the ground, inching slowly and not directly away from him and the path. I was waiting for a car to pass to execute the second part of my plan. The man began slowly following me, glancing back at the path and the ball left behind. I think he was getting suspicious, noticing that I was putting more space between us. "Why don't you go get the ball?" he suggested. "And I'll look for your phone and lock?" I quickly realized that would not only put me by the path, but also give him control over any communication I might have. Though the phone didn't exist, he wouldn't know that. For all I knew, he planned to use it to delay my mom from checking on me, giving him more time for whatever he intended. And I had no intention of finding out what that was. I was about to respond when, by sheer luck, a car passed by. A white vehicle driven by a woman with brown hair. The man saw the car and turned pale. I seized the opportunity to put the second part of my plan into action. "Oh no, that was my mom!" I shouted and made a run for my bike. "I've got to go. Bye!" He made no move to stop me. I don't know if it was because I was far enough from the path or if he was scared that my mother might have seen him alone with me, a possible witness. But as I rode away, we made eye contact for a moment. His friendly facade was gone. There was something dark in his eyes that I couldn't identify. He smiled, a creepy smile, like someone who knew nothing was funny but couldn't help smiling anyway, and gave me a salute, as if to say, "Well played." I never told my mom what happened, but a few days later I went back to that course when it was busy. I headed straight to the path the man had been so eager to lead me to. I found broken branches. On the bare dirt, I saw a few adult-sized footprints and what looked like smudged, dragged footprints about the size of my foot. A few feet away, I spotted a dirty, yellow sticker. That image has stayed with me my entire life. Last Friday, I-25F had some extra time before picking up my kids from school. It was a beautiful day, so I decided to take a drive along some back roads in my small, rural hometown while listening to music. As I was driving, I noticed a man with his thumb out, trying to catch a ride. He looked to be in his late 30s or early 40s, carrying a fishing pole and a backpack. Seemed pretty harmless, I guess. But as a lone woman, I've always been taught that it's safer to keep driving, given all the cautionary tales about picking up hitchhikers. So I kept going, but I couldn't help feeling a bit guilty. Thoughts like, if I were hitchhiking, I'd hope someone would pick me up, and what's the worst that could happen? Kept running through my mind. Plus, I'd recently made a commitment to face my fears whenever possible, so I decided that if he was still walking when I looped back around, I'd give him a ride. Sure enough, about 10 minutes later, he was still there. I felt a bit nervous as I pulled over, but what could I do? Just drive off while he was trying to get in? As soon as he got into the car, I realized I might have made a big mistake. First, he seemed really off and his smell was overwhelming. Second, the way he looked at me made me uncomfortable, like I was something he hadn't seen in a long time. I didn't realize just how uneasy I was until he asked for a cigarette, and I noticed my hands shaking so much that I could barely get one out of the pack. Driving helped me focus, but internally, I was freaking out, trying to figure out how I'd defend myself if he tried anything. He introduced himself as Wayne and mentioned that he lived about 5 minutes away from where I picked him up. As we drove, he told me about losing his license due to DUIs and how he was staying with an old man who didn't want to join him on this outing. He even tried to convince me to hang out at his place and come back the next day for drinks. When we finally reached his destination, it turned out to be a small, run-down shack surrounded by junk cars and debris. Wayne got out but kept urging me to come inside with him. I firmly said no and drove away, feeling relieved and a little proud that I'd faced one of my fears. Fast forward to Monday when my instructor casually mentioned, "Did you hear someone got murdered down on such and such road? Do you know anyone out that way?" I responded, "That's crazy. I actually gave a hitchhiker a ride down that road on Friday. His name was Wayne, I think." Not even 15 minutes later, I saw Wayne's picture on Facebook. Apparently, the authorities had picked him up for stabbing someone to death at the very house where I dropped him off. The details were gruesome. He stabbed the victim in the lungs, causing them to bleed out in that little shack. And the old man he claimed to be living with, turns out he didn't even exist. I swear, I'll never pick up another hitchhiker again. This was one of the creepiest and most unsettling experiences I've ever had. I was staying with my family, mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, in a cozy A-frame cabin in northern Washington. The area is full of dense forests, and our cabin was right by a lake. We had brought along our small boat to enjoy some time on the water. The trip was going great. We were having fun on the lake, spending quality time together, and just enjoying a peaceful vacation. At one point, my family decided to go to a convenience store, leaving me alone in the cabin. This happened a while ago, but I was old enough to stay home by myself. The nearest store was about 30 to 45 minutes down a dirt road. As you might guess, this is where things took a turn. I chose to stay behind because I was relaxed and didn't feel like getting in the car. About 15 minutes after they left, it started to get dark. I was wandering around, listening to music, and soaking in the beautiful view of the sunset over the lake. The cabin had large windows, typical of a chalet, and they didn't have any curtains. This made watching the sunset quite enjoyable, but also made the surroundings a bit eerie once night fell. Washington is known for its forests and has many stories about mysterious creatures. though this isn't about one of those. Still, the dark, dense forest around me added to the atmosphere. As I explored the cabin, something caught my eye. I thought I saw a slight movement down by the small boat dock, about 125 meters away along a winding path. At first, I brushed it off, thinking it was probably just a deer or some other animal moving through the woods. I soon forgot about the movement and headed to the bathroom, which was down a hallway, away from the windows. While I was in there, I suddenly had a terrible feeling, like something was very wrong. I wanted to check the cabin and look outside, but I couldn't since I was still in the bathroom. The longer I stayed in the bathroom, the worse the feeling became. Every raindrop on the roof felt like the ticking of a clock counting down to something ominous. I hurried out of the restroom and practically ran down the hall. When I looked out the large windows, all I saw was the quiet, lifeless forest and the moonlight reflecting off the lake. But then I started feeling that unsettling sensation of being watched, which we often dismiss as just our imagination. But this time, something really was watching me. I turned around and looked down the hall at another glass door at the end. To my shock, there was a figure standing on the other side. A deer, but it was standing on two legs. My mind immediately jumped to all the stories of strange creatures. I tried to stay calm, closing my eyes and sprinting back to the bathroom, the only room without windows. I locked myself in and sat in silence, barely daring to breathe, for what felt like an eternity. When my family finally returned, I came out and nothing seemed out of place. The next morning, we found no signs that anything had been there. Whether you believe me or think it was all in my head, it was still one of the scariest experiences I've ever had. It was late on a November evening in 2016, and I found myself at Munich Airport during a stopover. I was on my way back to Milan, where I was living at the time. The layover was supposed to be just half an hour, but my flight kept getting delayed. Eventually, I realized I wouldn't get home until well past midnight. When the plane finally arrived, the journey from Munich to Milan was quick, but when I reached the arrivals hall, I had an uneasy feeling that something wasn't right. I considered taking a taxi, but decided to stick with public transport, thinking it was just my nerves playing tricks on me. Fortunately, I lived in a central area and wasn't alone, but it was already around 1 a.m., and everyone at home would surely be asleep. I arrived at the central station and headed to the bus stop where the city bus ran. It was only 2 stops to my place, and I figured taking the bus was safer than walking all the way home. There was a group of sketchy-looking people at the bus stop, but I waited there anyway, reminding myself that I'd done this sort of thing before without any trouble. The bus arrived and I got on. My sense of unease deepened because something just didn't feel right. I felt very isolated as the only woman on the bus, with just a few men sitting quietly and 2 other women who seemed intoxicated. After a short trip that felt like forever, I finally got off at my stop. I decided not to listen to music on the walk home so I could be more aware of my surroundings. I only had a light bag, so the walk was easy, but the streets were unusually quiet. Normally, the area was busy with traffic even late at night, but now there wasn't a single car or person in sight. The silence was unsettling, with only the sound of light rain and my footsteps breaking it. I crossed the road, walked straight down the street, and turned left towards my apartment. When I reached the front door that led into the building's hallway, I noticed something strange. This door was always locked, only accessible to those with apartment keys. As I was about to unlock the door, I instinctively turned my head to the left, and there he was. A man was walking towards me, but I hadn't heard his footsteps. He walked at a normal pace, but the way he moved made me uncomfortable. I quickly unlocked the door, hoping he was just passing by, but he stopped right behind me, as if ready to enter the building too. His silence made me even more uneasy. I tried to ask if he lived there, just to get him to say something, but he didn't respond. I was too afraid to refuse him entry, worried he might become violent, or that he might actually live there and had just forgotten his keys. It was unlikely, though, since it was 1 a.m., and it seemed strange that the only person I saw was heading to the same place as me. We both went inside, and I walked quickly towards the stairs, trying to act natural. As I started up the stairs, I glanced back discreetly. The man was still standing at the entrance, closing the door slowly behind him, almost as if he didn't want anyone to hear him. I hurried up the stairs to the second floor, where I lived. The lock on my apartment door was a bit tricky, and of course it decided to give me trouble now. I tried to insert the key quietly, hoping he wouldn't hear where I was. After inserting the key, I paused to listen, trying to determine if he was following me. I heard nothing, and I wasn't sure if that was a relief or something more worrying. I carefully peeked over the railing, and there he was, still on the ground floor. He looked up at me and, to my horror, smiled, pointing at me as he started walking up the stairs slowly, never breaking eye contact. My heart raced as I fumbled with the lock, trying desperately to get it open. My phone had just come out of airplane mode, but the signal was weak. Thankfully, the phone connected to the apartment's Wi-Fi, and I tried to contact my friend who lived with me. No answer. The man kept coming, his movements slow and quiet. I tried to mask my fear, managing to say a shaky hello in English, hoping to get a response out of him. But he just stood there, staring at me, as if waiting for me to open the door. Finally, I got the door unlocked. I rushed inside, locked it behind me, and ran straight to my friend's bedroom. I didn't know what else to do, so I told her that something scary had just happened and that a man was standing outside our apartment. She shared the room with two other friends, and one of them woke up, annoyed that I had barged in. My friend got up, and I explained what had happened. She was almost in tears, and none of us dared to open the door to check if the man was still there. We peered through the peephole, but there was no one outside. I contacted my employer, who also owned the flat, and she advised me to call the police. I started worrying that if this man was dangerous, he might be waiting outside for another potential victim, and I felt guilty for letting him into the building. The police arrived about 30 minutes later, but the man was gone by then. He was nowhere to be found in the hallway. The police left, and we eventually went to bed. We never saw the man again. I still don't know what that man wanted. Maybe he was just someone looking for a place to sleep. After all, he didn't do anything to harm me. But if he had been more dangerous, no one would have seen or heard me. Back in 2014, I was out camping with a couple of friends, Phil and Tony, in the Amamore region of Queensland. We had my truck, an esky full of drinks, and a bunch of sausages. We were all set for a good camping trip. We spent the day driving through the forest on some 4WD tracks and eventually found a secluded spot by a creek to set up camp for the night. We lit a fire, had a barbecue, and spent some time fishing. We caught a few dewfish, a decent-sized bass, and even a turtle. As the night went on, something strange happened. Everything around us went silent. Earlier, the night was full of sounds. Birds calling, frogs croaking, crickets chirping. But now there was nothing except the crackling fire and the gentle flow of the creek. It was eerie, and Phil mentioned it, which made us all more uneasy. Suddenly, a loud splash came from up the creek, like something heavy had been thrown into the water. We all looked in that direction, but saw nothing. We tried to brush it off, thinking it was just a fish or a branch falling into the water. After a few tense minutes, the sounds of the forest returned as if nothing had happened. We stayed up a bit longer to shake off the nerves. Tony hooked something big, but his line snapped, adding to the tension. Phil and I tried our luck fishing again, but we only caught snags. Eventually, we decided to call it a night and set up our swags in a triangle around the fire. Phil fell asleep almost immediately, snoring loudly. I lay in my swag, gazing up at the stars through the fly screen, just about to drift off when I noticed that the silence had returned. The only sounds were Phil's snoring and the gentle lapping of the water. The fire had died down, and the wind had stilled. I started hearing sporadic noises, leaves rustling, twigs snapping, isolated sounds that made the silence even more unsettling. My heart skipped a beat when I heard stones shifting on the riverbank. At first, I told myself it was just some small animal, but the back of my mind kept insisting that it sounded like footsteps. I lay there, barely breathing, waiting to hear the sound again. After a minute of silence, I finally started to relax, until I heard it again, this time on the other side of my swag, just a few meters away. Then I heard sniffing, followed by the sound of something moving stealthily across the ground towards my swag. The flap on my swag was down, so I could only see the sky and the dying fire through the other side. I heard heavy breathing close to the canvas, and then something touched it, just centimeters from my face. I felt trapped. As the canvas moved slightly inward, I saw them, long, brownish-yellow fingers with black nails. I'm not gonna lie, I screamed at the top of my lungs. I started kicking and flailing, trying to get away. Tony woke up with a start, yelling, "What's going on?" before joining in the panic when he realized what was happening. There was a loud hoo-hoop sound from a distance, and whatever had been above me bolted across the riverbank, crashing loudly into the water. Phil woke up to our shouting and the splashing sounds. Tony and I had already scrambled out of our swags and were running to the car. Phil quickly followed, seeing the fear on our faces and the abandoned campsite. We jumped into the truck, leaving our gear behind. As I turned on the headlights, we caught a glimpse of something. A tall, yellowish-brown figure moving behind a large tree. Phil saw it too and started to panic. I floored it out of the forest, not caring about the rough terrain. Every creek crossing on the way out was terrifying, but we eventually made it back onto the main road. As we crossed a small bridge, we noticed a trail of splashed water, as if something or someone had moved from one side to the other. After what we'd just seen, we were convinced it was the same creature. Later, Tony told me he had seen the thing crouched over my swag when I screamed. He hadn't heard footsteps, just a strange, swirling sound in the water. He described the creature as having large eyes, prominent cheekbones, and strange ridges on its head. He thought it might have been something otherworldly. I'm not so sure. That was the last time I went camping with the boys. I eventually moved to the city, but whenever I visit the area, I get uneasy crossing creeks or rivers, half expecting to see something staring back at me from the water. I don't know what we encountered that night, and I don't plan on finding out. Even the beach makes me nervous now. Does anyone have any idea what we might have come across? We all saw something, and whatever it wasn't human. The creek feeds into the Mary River, which is home to ancient creatures like the lungfish. Maybe there's something even stranger lurking in those waters. I want to share one of the wildest experiences of my life. Unfortunately, I didn't capture it on camera because I was too scared to move. If it weren't for my friend, I don't know what might have happened to us. This took place in Shepherd, Michigan, a small town surrounded by dirt roads and cornfields. I was visiting a friend, and we were pretty bored as the sun was setting. So we decided to take a walk to the downtown area, which is just a small strip of restaurants along the only paved road. It took us about an hour to get there. At that point, I hadn't noticed anything unusual in the sky. We arrived at a park on the edge of downtown, where there were a couple of sheriff's vehicles parked nearby. My friend mentioned that the police were on the lookout for some car hoppers, and I thought it was a bit over the top for them to be using a helicopter to search for them. Coming from the city, it seemed kind of funny to me. Anyway, after about 20 minutes at the park, we decided to head back home. As we turned onto a dirt road, passing the parked police car, we noticed something strange. There were fields on both sides of the road and a forest in the distance to our right. Suddenly, we saw it, a UFO. It took me a moment to process what I was seeing, but there, hovering low in the air just above the trees, was a rod-like object. It was about the size of a bus, maybe two, and appeared to be slanted in the air. There were two bright green lights on each end, glowing vividly against the dark countryside. I had my flashlight out so we could see in the dark. As soon as I realized I was looking at a UFO, I reached for my phone to take a picture. But before I could do that, the object started spiraling towards us, like a fan spinning in the air. This massive rod-like object was coming right at us, and we could hear the wind whipping around it. There was also a helicopter somewhere out of sight. I was frozen in place, unable to react, overwhelmed by fear and confusion. Just when it seemed like the object might crash into us, my friend pushed my hands down, still holding my phone and flashlight away from the UFO. Immediately, the object stopped, repositioned itself, and began slowly moving away just above our heads. I could make out lines on its surface. The helicopter had come into view now, flying right in front of the object as if guiding it away. The whole scene was unfolding right over downtown, the one place where anyone could have seen it. We stood there for a minute or two watching in awe and terror. I regret not recording it so much, just to be able to revisit that moment or share this terrifying experience with others. But all I have are my memories. I'm not sure if anyone else reported this, and maybe that's why the police were there. There was a police car parked at the corner, near an old repair shop, facing the wrong way. I don't know if anyone else in downtown saw what we saw, but if anyone was outside, they couldn't have missed it. It's strange because we didn't notice anything during our hour-long walk, but this thing appeared in the field during the 20 minutes or so we were at the park. My friend tried to rationalize it afterward, saying it must have been some kind of police aircraft. But when I explained that we don't have or aren't supposed to have technology that defies gravity like that, she fell silent. That day, she definitely became a believer in UFOs. I should start by saying that I've never enjoyed camping. Every summer, my parents sent me to a camp in Colorado, which always included at least one trip into the woods. Even though these trips were short, I always dreaded them. The heavy backpacks, no bathrooms, and the spiders that always seemed to find their way into my tent. But when I turned 16 and became a counselor in training, my attitude changed briefly. At that age, we were just a few years older than the oldest campers, but we were given a surprising amount of freedom. Most nights, we had to stay in the cabin with our campers, but there was a rumor that the camping trip was different. It was said that the counselors in training would sneak off, hang out, and maybe even get into a little trouble after everyone else went to sleep. What I didn't know was that this particular camping trip would make me never want to camp in the woods again. The trip started like any other. There were about 30 of us. For counselors in training, for counselors, and around 20 boys and girls between the ages of 13 and 14. We walked in a single file line along the trails, with the chatter and laughter of the campers drowning out most of the natural sounds. After several hours, we passed through a marshy area and started climbing a steep hill covered in evergreens and aspens. Since I wasn't the most athletic kid, I ended up at the back of the line with another counselor in training, Jordan, and two campers who were also struggling to keep up. We were chatting and, without realizing it, fell further and further behind the group until the last of them disappeared around a bend up ahead. We weren't too worried, so we kept our slower pace, but after 30 minutes or so, the trail leveled off and I started feeling uneasy. The rest of the group had vanished, and we were now in a stretch of dead trees, many of which looked like they had been scorched by a fire, while others seemed to have died from disease. The eerie atmosphere was made worse by the sight of an old, abandoned cabin sitting in the middle of the burnt forest, untouched by the fire that must have swept through. We were so caught up in the strange scene that one of the campers screamed when a twig snapped behind us. Jordan and I laughed at first, but we stopped abruptly when we turned to see where the sound had come from. About 20 feet behind us was a disheveled man with wild, black hair and a long beard, slowly making his way up the trail with his eyes fixed on us. He didn't appear to have any hiking gear, and we had no idea how long he had been following us. Being young, we were naturally pretty freaked out, but Jordan managed a small wave and said, "Let's catch up with the rest of the group." As we turned to continue up the path, the man mumbled something. Jordan, to my surprise, asked him to repeat himself. The man spoke a little louder this time. "Going camping?" Jordan replied that we were. The man then smiled slightly and said in a creepy, ominous tone, "Better be careful." We nodded, gave a half-hearted thank you, and hurried up the trail to find the rest of the group, picking up our pace considerably. Although the man had been walking behind us, he didn't continue after we passed him. He just stood there, watching us as we made our way up the winding path and out of sight. When we finally caught up to the rest of the group, who had been waiting for us, we told the adult counselors about the encounter. They shrugged it off, saying the man probably lived in that cabin and was just curious about what we were doing near his property. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling, even after we reached the campsite. I kept feeling like the man was somehow following us. But eventually, I managed to relax and even enjoy myself a bit. Later that night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Jordan and another counselor in training from the boys' cabin brought 2 warm drinks they had swiped from the counselor's supplies, and I pulled out a joint I had saved for the occasion. To stay out of trouble, we decided to walk a bit into the woods to smoke by the river where we had washed our pots and pans earlier. The spot was eerily quiet, and the man from earlier kept creeping into my thoughts. Jordan must have noticed I was on edge because he offered me his blue hoodie, which led one of the other girls to suggest we switch tents for the night so I could sleep in the same tent with him. I didn't mind, so after smoking, we returned to our tents, which were set up a little away from the others, and we quietly drank while sharing ghost stories. Some time passed, and just as one of the boys was finishing up a story, we heard footsteps crunching on pine needles about 40 feet away near one of the other campers' tents. We assumed it was just someone going to the bathroom, but we were already on edge, so we decided to call it a night and retreated to our tents. Jordan followed, and after some awkward flirting, we both drifted off to sleep. I'm not sure what time it was, but it was late when I woke up to the distinct sound of footsteps right outside my tent. Adrenaline shot through me, and I tried to stay as still and quiet as possible. Whoever it was seemed to be pacing back and forth, just a few feet away. I turned to wake Jordan, but was reassured when I noticed he wasn't in the tent. Assuming he had been the one outside, I relaxed and was about to fall back asleep when I heard the tent unzip. Jordan climbed in, lay down next to me, and wrapped his arms around me. I was nearly asleep again when I realized I needed to go to the bathroom. I muttered something to Jordan about needing to pee and started unzipping my sleeping bag. Jordan seemed a bit annoyed by the noise, but he just rolled over and pulled his hoodie up over his head. Trying not to wake him, I unzipped the tent and checked the campsite for any movement. Seeing nothing unusual, I put on my shoes and headed to the designated bathroom area. Just as I got there and started to go, I heard rustling back at the campsite, like someone rummaging through our bags. I quickly tried to pull my pants up, but in my haste, I lost my balance and grabbed a branch that snapped loudly. As I tried to regain my composure, I looked up to see a figure moving across the campsite toward me. Before I could react, I was blinded by a flashlight beam, and the figure was getting closer. Panicked, I froze, but then I heard Jordan's voice. "Sorry, it's just me." I breathed a sigh of relief, but then Jordan asked something that made my heart race. "Have you seen my blue hoodie? I know you gave it back to me, but I think one of the campers might have taken it from my bag while I was sleeping." Confused, I stammered. "But you were just wearing it when you got back in the tent." What he said next sent chills down my spine. "What are you talking about? It's been missing since we got back from the river. I even went down there to check, but when I couldn't find it, I came back to camp and saw you." My confusion turned to terror as I realized that the person who had gotten into the tent with me earlier wasn't Jordan. Sensing that something was wrong, Jordan asked what had happened, and I explained that someone had been in our tent, wearing his hoodie. Not believing me, Jordan insisted we check the tent. As quietly as possible, we crept back, and when Jordan shined his flashlight through the nylon lining, he let out a sharp gasp. We could clearly see the outline of a person lying still inside the tent.
The next moments are a blur, but we ran to the other side of the campsite where the older counselors were sleeping and frantically woke them up, yelling that there was someone in our tent. It took a few seconds for them to understand what we were saying, but when they did, they rushed to the tent. However, by the time they got there, the tent was unzipped and the intruder was gone, leaving behind a mess of our belongings scattered across the ground. The counselors radioed back to the main camp to call the police, and it was clear they were just as frightened as we were. None of us slept after that. Thankfully, it wasn't long before dawn, and by then, a few more counselors had arrived with firearms to escort us back to camp. On the way down, one of the campers found Jordan's jacket tied around a tree like some kind of marker. Needless to say, Jordan didn't want it back, and we left it there. To this day, I can't say for sure if the man in the tent was the same guy we ran into earlier on the trail, but his face and that night still haunt me.
In 1999, I was in my mid-40s and had just left a stressful and unfulfilling career as a management consultant. I needed a new focus, and my passion for historic buildings led me to the idea of restoring one. I began scouring auction catalogs in search of the perfect place. After missing out on several London properties that didn't quite resonate with me, I expanded my search. My father, who often gave me advice over the phone, suggested I concentrate on Derbyshire, a county with strong family ties. Together, we discussed what the ideal home would look like. A stone-built cottage, a south-facing garden, with at least 2 bedrooms and a workshop. Not long after one of these conversations, my father, who was in good health, suddenly passed away. It was a shock, and I put my search on hold until after the funeral. When I finally returned to the catalogs, I quickly found Lowe's Cottage. Nestled in the Derbyshire Dales village of Upper Mayfield, it was built in the late 18th century by a stonemason who needed a home with a workshop. It seemed to be just what my father and I had envisioned. I went to see the cottage the day before the auction. The approach was through Hanging Bridge and Gallows Tree Lane, with the house named after a nearby ancient burial mound. The agent wouldn't allow me to film inside, which should have given me pause, but I was captivated by the cottage and its stunning Peak District views. The next day at the auction, there was a lively atmosphere, and I ended up winning the bid after going £6,000 over the guide price. I was immediately approached by a reporter who asked, "How does it feel to have bought England's most haunted cottage?" I was taken aback, having had no idea about the house's reputation. It turns out that a couple, Andrew and Josie Smith, who purchased Lowe's Cottage in 1994, had filed a lawsuit against the previous owners for not disclosing that the property was haunted. The Smiths claimed they were forced out by strange occurrences, including what they described as a creeping presence that turned into a thick fog. They reported sudden cold spots, damp patches on the walls, and objects moving on their own. Their account was supported by a local vicar, who described experiencing strange odors that moved around the house and a wall that seemed to weep when touched. Although the judge dismissed the case, I began to understand the Smiths' concerns during my first night in the cottage. My dog, Cyan, was uneasy and restless. The lights flickered, temperatures changed abruptly, and my TV would turn on by itself. More odd events followed. Reporters who visited the cottage experienced malfunctions with their equipment, reminding me of the agent's earlier refusal to allow filming. When patches of moisture began appearing on the walls, I recalled the vicar's mention of a weeping wall. It felt as if Lowe's Cottage had a personality of its own, as if it was testing me. However, I never felt any malevolence. I later met the Smiths and found them to be genuine, sensible people. In time, Cyan seemed to make peace with the house, and the strange occurrences ceased. I spent 4 happy years living there before eventually renting it out. Only one tenant ever reported anything unusual. In the months after the auction, several people told me that the house would be a blessing, and they were right. Despite its odd reputation, Lowe's Cottage, which seemed to have been foreseen by my father, became a turning point in my life, leading me from an unhappy chapter to a more fulfilling one focused on restoring historic properties.